thank you for, yeah, I'm not going to, yeah, now, I'm not brave enough to even attempt to speak any Korean, but I do know how to use Google Translate. So yeah, I would just like to thank everyone, Sangwei in particular, for the invite to South Korea and to Yonsei University. It is a fantastic honour, and yeah, I'm hoping that this is the start of a very long and successful collaboration. Not just between Ulster University and Yonsei University, but all the other UK and Irish universities. Okay. What am I going to talk about? Well, first of all, I'll do a very brief recap on the idea of complex PTSD and PTSD as defined by the ICD-11. Talk a little bit about the development and validation of the International Trauma Questionnaire. This is the kind of only standardized, tailored self-report measure that assesses the exact symptoms of PTSD and complex PTSD as per the ICD-11. Then I'll move on to probably one of the main thrust of the talk, and that's this idea about the development of clinical checks. We think this is an important methodological development in terms of assessment. I suppose we think this is important kind of in terms of methods, but we also think it's incredibly important in terms of clinical assessment. And Sangwei was talking about the broader aspects of the Inspire project. We're looking at kind of biomarkers and innovative ways to kind of identify symptoms and of PTSD and complex PTSD. And I suppose if you do that, you need to be honing in on the exact clinical presentation of the symptoms of PTSD, of PTSD and complex PTSD. And we think we may have a method by which we can cut through some of the non-clinical noise in our measures. Again, yeah, just like Philip, I'll finish up with some blatant advertising, telling you about the www.traumameasuresglobal.com. Okay. I think at this point, what I'm supposed to do is talk about the plan and the strategy that I had many years ago in order to kind of steer my own career and identify important aspects of psychology related to trauma and the traumatic response to investigate. But if I said that, I'd be telling lies. I'd be telling lies because I suppose a lot of my career has been determined by kind of serendipity, by good fortune and good luck. Sangwei put up the email that I shamelessly sent to almost every psychologist in the world, promoting our new measures. But what was wonderful and a touch of good fortune was that all those years ago, I got an email back from South Korea saying, I'm interested in this. It seems amazing that, I don't know, 4 years later, I'm standing here in Yonsei University. I suppose it's a sign of sometimes good fortune just comes into play. But I think I'm kind of steeped in good fortune because it was about 15 years ago, I got an email from someone called Philip Hyland saying, Dear Mark, I'd be interested in doing some work in PTSD. Would you consider being a PhD supervisor? So I said yes. Moved forward a few years later. Phil and myself were collaborators. We were working extensively in the area of PTSD. And we were working with a colleague of mine, Professor Ask Elklet, in the psychotraumatology unit in Denmark. And we were seeing some of these really kind of early ideas about complex PTSD. And we were getting very excited. There was no way to measure PTSD and complex PTSD at that point. There was no standardized measures because the ICD was in this kind of development phase. It was asking researchers to generate knowledge, to generate research, to try and help inform their initial thoughts about what this new type of PTSD should be and what this kind of complex PTSD might look like. My good luck hadn't run out at that stage, because I got another email from someone sitting in the front, Professor Thanos Karatsias, who I'd never heard of. And he said, Mark, I'm in Napier University. I will be in Ulster University next week. Would it be okay if we had a chat? Ulster University has got 4 campuses. I work in the campus that's in the very northwest of Northern Ireland, at the very, very western part of Europe. We never get people who just walk by. So I was thinking, well, of course, if somebody wants to speak, that's fine. So Thanos came along and we had a coffee. We started chatting, and he said, he explained he was working with some people. They were generating some ideas and doing some research about this new idea of complex PTSD. And he said that he was feeding into 2 working groups. So the ICD-11, when they have a revision for all the different disorders, they set up these kind of research working groups, and their job is to generate research findings and feed into a kind of working group head, and then they summarize and feed that information back up into the WHO. At that point, I have no idea what happens. It's a very complex organization, and I'm kind of at the bottom of that food chain. So Thanos said, well, I'm working with 2 of these research groups. One is led by Professor Chris Bruin, who Phil was telling you about. At this point, I was getting a little bit hot under the collar. We've got these are kind of academic superstar. And Marilyn Cloydra, who was in charge of the working group for the complex bit of PTSD and complex PTSD. So he said, would you like to join? Would Philip and yourself like to join? And I had to take all of maybe 1 second to think about it, and I said, of course, I'd be delighted. So that's where this work started. So I suppose I come into this process where there had been a kind of body. The work was starting to develop some kind of momentum. In 2013, Andreas Merker had published a paper kind of outlining the kind of basic structure of what the ICD were proposing, and this was very exciting. When diagnostic manuals, when they are revised, normally there's not too many changes. Particularly in the psychological dimensions, we know there's things like anxiety and depression, and the symptoms, the structure, the diagnostic kind of organization stays very consistent from one revision to the next. But this revision, the 11th revision, was actually quite radical. It was radical in that there was a marked deviation between the ICD-11 and the DSM-5. And this deviation was very significant in 2 ways. Phil's alluded to these. First of all, that they didn't change the idea of PTSD. They were going for a very much more focused, trimmed down diagnostic description of PTSD that focused just on these core trauma-related symptoms. So there was obviously the requirement for a stressor, but it focused on re-experiencing, focused on avoidance, and this sense of perceived current threat. The ICD is also very, very clear in the requirement for some type of functional impairment being present along with the symptoms. So that was a major development. The other major development was this idea that there was going to be a kind of sibling stress disorder called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as Phil said, was PTSD, plus this collection of associated symptoms given this umbrella term of disturbances in self-organization. These were described in this kind of early description, as you can see on the screen. These were kind of revised somewhat over time. Very kind of quick bit of kind of background. So when we started this work, the kind of philosophy or the ethos of this revision was becoming clear. First of all, it was the assessment of PTSD had to be kind of significantly reduced in terms of the number of symptoms and focused directly more on the stress response. This was in marked contrast to the DSM. The DSM was going in a completely other direction. The symptom set was becoming larger and larger. The number of symptom clusters was increasing. It was becoming a much broader type of disorder. So the kind of PTSD working group, that was an easy working group to be in, because Chris Bruin was running that, and he already had this answer. So that was pretty straightforward. The second idea behind the ICD proposals at the time was to try and reduce the complexity of these disorders. The DSM the DSM, it's developed and grown over the years with different editions, but PTSD is going in one direction. It's becoming much broader with an increasing number of symptoms. In the DSM-3, I think it started, there was 13 symptoms described in terms of 3 symptom clusters. Then I think in the DSM-3R, then that moved up to 17 symptoms across 3 clusters. Then the factor analytic work on this model seemed to be overwhelming, that there was 4 clusters. So in DSM-5, then there were these 4 clusters with 20 symptoms, and this leads to chaos. This leads to chaos because of the increasing number of permutations or different ways that PTSD can be presented. These 2 folks, Isaac Galatasser-Levy and Richard Brad, Isaac did the sums, and he found out that with 4 clusters and 20 symptoms, there are 636,000 ways to have post-traumatic stress disorder, as per the DSM-5. When you think about a set of symptoms as a diagnosis to describe a disorder, this would seem like abject failure to me, that you can have over 500,000 people in front of you, all with the same disorder, but all with unique presentations. So again, this seemed to be grounds for the simplification of the disorders. The third ethos was the third part of the rationale was to kind of reduce comorbidity. I suppose PTSD is, if you find someone, I'm not a clinician, but my understanding is that if you find someone with PTSD and no other psychological disorder, you have a clinical unicorn. You have a mythical kind of entity, and this is evidenced by the fact that people who are diagnosed with PTSD almost invariably will meet the criteria for things like anxiety, depression, substance use, and a whole range of other disorders. So this was the backdrop against which we kind of tried to develop a standardized, tailored measure of PTSD and complex PTSD. The folks in the working group, they had done some preliminary work. They had developed a kind of good body of items to measure both PTSD and these DSO symptoms. And I suppose to a certain degree, my role was to be the nerd of the outfit. My interests are in multivariate statistical analysis and factor analysis, IRT models. So the one part of Philip himself, our job was to take this body of data and try and develop the most tailored set of items that best describe PTSD and DSO against the backdrop of what I've just described. If you've managed to stay awake after reading our paper on the memory and identity theory of complex PTSD, if you've still managed to stay awake, this will definitely do the job. This will put you to sleep. It's a highly technical, very, very boring paper, but it was a very important paper where we took this large number of DSO symptoms and tried to find the optimal 6 indicators that measured the 3 symptom clusters of affective dysregulation, negative self-concept, and disturbed relationships. And this is what we came up with. We don't need to labour this. Phil has shown this. We've got 6 core. We've got 6 core symptoms of PTSD, 6 core symptoms of DSO, and these are organised in 6 symptom clusters. The diagnostic kind of algorithm has been explained by Phil. What we did is we put this together and we developed this self-report measure called the International Trauma Questionnaire, and this was published in 2018. As Philip said, this was against the backdrop of increasing kind of interest in the idea of PTSD and complex PTSD in the academic community and not just the clinical community. This is available in the Trauma Measures Global website. If you're interested in seeing more of this scale, you can go there, and I'm very proud of myself. Managed to use this technology. As you can see, I'm doing this with no hands. There's the website. There's a description of the scale. There's all the necessary citations. Here's a copy of the actual finalized item set, and all this material is freely available from the website. The DSO symptoms along the functional impairment. I don't need to go through these. I'm sure if you're at your computer, you can access these. All the scoring information is freely available there also. Okay. So I can do some shameless boasting about the ITQ. I can modestly say since 2018, the original paper has been cited 1,166 times. There's been over 6,000 reads on ResearchGate. We've developed and validated additional versions of the scale for caregivers, for young people. It's been translated in over 25 different languages. I think there's probably more. The ITQ web page has been visited over 40,000 times. As part of an academic exercise, Thanos and myself, we did a kind of we did some research to try and find out how often the ITQ is being used, and we think there's probably close to about 250,000 individual kind of administrations of this measure. It's a primary outcome variable in PTSD and complex PTSD trials, standard measure for the prevalence of PTSD and complex PTSD in the population. And at this point, you'd be going, I mean, this man's arrogance knows no bounds that he will boast so much about this scale. We do think that it certainly has served a purpose, but of course, it's a self-report measure. And as such, there could be some concerns or critiques raised about the use of a self-report measure in order to assess these kind of very complex psychological disorders. Indeed, there are some people that say, well, something like the ITQ can't generate even a kind of probable diagnosis because of the problems associated with self-report. If you want to make a diagnosis or do an accurate clinical assessment, then an interview, a clinical interview, is required. And I suppose there's some evidence to support that. What we know is that if you measure PTSD and complex PTSD symptoms, or symptoms of any psychological disorder, by self-report and then by clinical interview, the prevalence rate will be lower for symptoms and the diagnosis. It will be lower for interviews compared to self-reports. There's some evidence that there might be some cognitive processes underlying this. There's evidence that this might happen with the ITQ. There's an analogue of the ITQ, which is the ITI. That's the interview analogue. It's the International Trauma Interview. And there has been some research conducted by colleagues here from Lithuania, for example, where they administered both the ITQ and the ITI. And what we were seeing was that the percentage of endorsement for each of the symptoms tended to be higher using the ITQ compared to the ITI. For example, we can see the re-experiencing 47% for the ITI, 60% for the ITQ. And this was consistent not just for the PTSD symptoms, but also for the DSO symptoms. And then if you look at kind of overall rates, what we see is that kind of endorsement rates are higher based on the self-report compared to the interview. This isn't something that's associated just with the measures of ICD-11 stress-related disorders. What we see is that if you compare DSM measures of PTSD, the PCL-5 is a self-report measure, the CAPS-5 is a interview measure. What we see is that the mean level of the 20 symptoms, almost without exception, is lower for the interview measure compared to the self-report measure. It's not surprising then when you aggregate up to the kind of symptom cluster level that there's significantly higher levels on the self-report measure. So this is something that we've been thinking about and wondering if we can do something about this, because false positives could suggest that respondents interpret normative experiences as clinically significant problems and endorse those items more readily on the self-report measures. So the idea is that the discrepancy between interviews and self-report, the underlying idea is that the interview is always right, and if there's any discrepancy, it must be that the self-report is wrong. I think that's not 100% the case. Phil himself have done some writing on this, and we think that this kind of almost universally held belief is challengeable. But I suppose, why is this? What is the difference between interview and self-report? And it's probably the role of the clinician Because the clinician can clarify things. The clinician can clarify 3 aspects of any symptom. They can clarify, first of all, the meaning. Yes, they can explain the meaning. If the client doesn't understand or is misrepresenting what that symptom means, they can clarify. They can maybe inquire about the severity of the symptom or the intensity or frequency. So they're very good at checking and ruling out these false positives. So we've got a clinician here talking to their client, and they say, do you ever have memories of a stressful event? And the client says, yes, every few days I think about it. Is that a re-experiencing symptom? Don't really know. But as a good clinician, I realize this is terribly simplistic, they might say, are these memories vivid like you're experiencing the event again? As Phil said, is it occurring in the here and now? Because that is the key defining clinical characteristic of an intrusive symptom. If somebody says no, then we know it's probably not a symptom. If they say yes, then we can quite safely say, well, that is a symptom. Are you with me? So the idea is that a clinician is required to check the answer, primarily to avoid the false positives, because the differences between self-report and interviews are consistent in terms of their differences. So we were thinking about whether we could incorporate some type of clinical checks into self-report, because the difference between these 2 kind of modalities is enormous. The ITQ takes about a minute to conduct or to complete. The ITI, the interview, is about somewhere between 40 and 60 minutes, requires training and so on. There's a kind of gulf between these 2 techniques. What we were thinking, is it possible to check some of the self-report? That is, bring the clinician into the self-report measure. We thought this might be a good idea, so we did. I realize I'm running very short of time. We decided to do a kind of proof of principle study to determine if we could use these checks, and we used a different ICD disorder, and that was prolonged grief disorder. It's a new diagnosis that just entered into the ICD in 2018, and it's an interesting disorder, and one that's very, very difficult to measure, because when you lose a loved one, you're supposed to feel bad. Yeah, you're supposed to think about them. The normal reaction is that you will think a lot about the person that you've lost. Yeah, you will yearn for them. You'll yearn for more contact. You'll feel sad. You'll have a flattened affect, and so on. And these are kind of the symptoms of prolonged grief disorder. So differentiating a kind of normal response to a pathological grief response is very, very difficult. We tried to do this in one of our measures. We developed the International Grief Questionnaire. And we looked at this and thought, well, these kind of false positives are probably very, very likely for things like yearning, for thinking too much about the deceased and so on, because these are kind of normative responses. So we worked up some follow-up questions that if someone endorsed an item, then they were presented with these clinical checks. So if they, on the Likert scale, if they scored 2 or more, then these clinical checks would pop up on the screen. So if they endorsed yearning, then they were asked, this is more than just missing your loved one. It is an intense and painful desire to be with the deceased again. Is this what you felt almost every day over the past week? So we're inquiring about intensity, about duration, and clarifying the clinical aspect of the symptom. We did this, we collected some population level data, and what we found was that there were significant reductions in the symptom endorsement when we applied these clinical checks. And some of them are kind of interesting. The biggest reduction in endorsement were those symptoms that we thought were more slippery, they were more difficult to differentiate a kind of pathological from a normative response. This seemed like a good idea based on this evidence, so we moved on to develop some clinical checks for the ITQ. We developed a group of experts, those people who had developed the ITQ initially, and what we did was take each of the ITQ items, we developed a clinical check, and then provided a rationale for that. So we had these for the PTSD symptoms and also for the DSO symptoms. This is automated. We can automate the implementation of these clinical checks and online surveys, and we did this using a large-scale population survey. And what did we find? Well, what we found was that once we applied these clinical checks, we were finding a very significant decrease in the endorsement rates for each of the symptoms, and these were translating into decreases in diagnostic rates. So at the disorder level, 5.4% met the requirements for PTSD without the clinical checks, and this dropped to just under 4% with the clinical checks. 9.5 met the requirements for CPTSD without the clinical checks, and this dropped to 4.9 with the clinical checks. So the absolute difference doesn't seem a lot, but the relative decrease is very large at about 50%. So what we're seeing is significant and marked decreases in each of the symptoms, and this is carried through into the overall prevalence rates. What we're seeing is that the prevalence rates for PTSD and complex PTSD using these clinical checks is in and around what we would be expecting, or what we've seen in the literature when you're using very long, highly structured interview schedules or full-scale clinical assessments. So in conclusion, we've embedded these checks into the ITQ. We think that these prevalence rates based on these checked responses are consistent with clinical interviews. And we're interested, if anybody's interested in this idea, we want to look at the concordance between the ITQ with clinical checks and clinical interviews. And we're in the process of developing online apps where these can be rolled out more easily. Folks, I think I've spoken for a few minutes more than I should have, but I'll thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.